There is no defense counsel on the other side defending Watson. It's a one-sided procedure, and that's why there's an expression amongst lawyers that a grand jury, if they wanted to, they could even indict a ham sandwich, because it's not a real procedure. The prosecutor gets to pick everything. So that's why, if you're a statistics person, more often than not, if a grand jury gets the case, if the DA actually gives the case to a grand jury, which they've decided to hear, more often than not, they return an indictment. It's just the numbers here. So if you're a betting guy, I'm going to put it at like minus 200 that they come actually back with an indictment here.
You got your Mac guys here on Birds 365 on the JAKIB Media YouTube channel. What do we need to tell the folks here, John, before we talk to Dan Lust?
Like, share, and subscribe so we can get great guests like Dan Lust. That's how you do it.
He is so much better at that than me. Sports attorney and professor in New York law, Dan Lust joins us here on Birds 365. Dan, good to have you back. They're keeping you busy these days, all these professional sports leagues with legal issues, huh?
You know what? It's a little bit of sports law bingo. It's all over the place. We've got betting issues, some civil issues, some criminal issues. So always a pleasure to get the call from you guys.
Dan, for us in Philadelphia, obviously the biggest story is probably Deshaun Watson, and things finally moving forward from a criminal perspective, set to bring the case to a grand jury. Kind of explain to the listeners what that means, and there's going to be some clarity, at least for NFL teams, once a decision is made by a grand jury, either Friday or early next week.
Yes and no. And if you're not alone in Philadelphia, right, you're also getting the same calls from Tampa, and I'm getting the same calls from Carolina. Everyone says this is a very big story, which it is, right? When we started this past offseason, there were probably 4 or 5 really big name quarterbacks that could potentially be moved, right? Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson being one of them. And now, right, we're almost done playing musical chairs. Rodgers has returned. Wilson has now moved on. We'll see if Brady wants to unretire, right? Another name we're checking off. But Watson, at least me, I'll explain. This Friday appearance, this presentment to the grand jury is a really big deal. The only reason I'm going to push back, John, regardless of what happens Friday, we just went through an entire NFL season without criminal charges, just with the civil case, and Deshaun Watson did not play. So it certainly wasn't the criminal case that was keeping him back. He wasn't charged with anything for a full year. So I don't necessarily know if Friday will be clarity, but that is one big domino. So what the grand jury process is, and I'll keep it pretty, easy to explain. It's a one-sided procedure. The prosecutor gets to go up and cherry pick the best pieces of evidence. It's not My Cousin Vinny. It's not Law and Order. It's not, A Few Good Men. There is no defense counsel on the other side defending Watson. It's a one-sided procedure. And that's why there's an expression amongst lawyers that a grand jury, if they wanted to, they could even indict a ham sandwich, because it's not a real procedure. The prosecutor gets to pick everything. So that's why, if you're a statistics person, more often than not, if a grand jury gets the case, if the DA actually gives the case to a grand jury, which they've decided to hear, more often than not, they return an indictment. It's just the numbers here. So if you're a betting guy, I'm going to put it at like minus 200 that they come actually back with an indictment here.
So once they get an indictment, let's take another step here.
Right.
Then they decide what charges they would like to pursue. That there are many different things that Deshaun Watson could be charged with, most of which are misdemeanors, but some of which are felonies. Where does the next step in the process go? How much of it is politically motivated in the decision-making in that hometown as to what they want to see happen and how they will best be perceived as the decisions they make as to go forward?
Yeah, so there's a couple things here, right? There's 22 women that have filed civil cases against Deshaun Watson. As far as I know, and I heard, there was comments from Tony Busby, the attorney, who happens to be the attorney for all 22 of these accusers, which you can read as being odd or I guess normal. I'm not sure what to necessarily make of it. But of those 22, only 8 are being subpoenaed to the grand jury on Friday. That's not to say that there might be more on Monday or Tuesday, but as of Friday, only 8. So, Jody, there's a question of whether there's going to be a misdemeanor charge here, which is any offense that could be punishable by up to 1 year in jail, or a felony, which is obviously more than 1 year. The issue for Deshaun Watson, let's say it's a misdemeanor, right? I don't think anyone's thinking that this is going to be some type of violation, slap on the wrist. If it's a misdemeanor, the problem is you're dealing with, right, in theory, 22 different women, maybe 8 different women. So you have to multiply out those charges. So from a political standpoint, I don't know how you could just charge one case without the other, without more cases being charged. So you're looking at an exponentially longer prison sentence potentially if there are charges. That's what Watson has to worry about. It's a pattern of offenses. And if you find one case that looks good, 2 cases, 3 cases, then all of a sudden Watson is looking at a number of potential years, even on a misdemeanor charge.
All right, so let's look at the crystal ball, Dan. So you as a lawyer, if your client goes in and you just gave the statistics, if the DA is going to give the case to a grand jury, more likely than not, there's going to be an indictment. From that standpoint, if there's an indictment, the DA still doesn't have to prosecute the case. Is that correct? But in this political type situation, if she's bringing it, it would be an indication that we're going to move forward. Is that how you would look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll take a couple steps back. They've investigating this case for a full year, right?
By the way, while you say that, does that timing, it's been so long, the investigation's been so long, does that tell you anything? Just the length of it?
Right. No, there's 2 ways to read into it. I think the first way, right, we all know, right, if there's potentially a murder charge somewhere, so they bring charges immediately, right? There's the big press conference, they bring charges. So those are more open and shut. The fact that this has taken a year tells you that there's a couple things at play. A, it was never open and shut to begin with, that they had to conduct a full investigation. And probably beyond that, too, this is Houston. The Houston Texans are involved. The DA's office is probably worried about some political blowback. So they want to make sure they have this right. So there were some subpoenas that went out for electronic devices toward the end of last year. So either they're deciding to take the case to a grand jury with the same case that was not open and shut as of March of 2021, or probably more likely, they found things along the way that us 3, Jody, John, we don't know about, but that the police know about that have strengthened the case, so much so that they now feel comfortable bringing the case in April. Certainly a lot of ways to read it, but you don't investigate a case for a full year, right, and give out these different subpoenas, right, to do absolutely nothing with it. So I think the signal here, again, you don't bring the case unless you think you can get a grand jury indictment, or else you'll look really stupid. So, and you also don't bring criminal charges, right, unless you think you can get a conviction. So a lot of things here, the fact that they made the decision to bring it to a grand jury tells you that they think there's enough here that the DA's office won't get blowback from losing on this.
All right, Dan, we're going to drag you into a conversation John and I had yesterday.
Let's do it, Tony.
John and I both readily admit we're faux attorneys. We're just playing games here on YouTube. You're an actual attorney, so we need you to kind of legislate for us. I said yesterday that I thought there was a possibility, and if there's none, please tell me so. If they do go forward with a case against them, and they bring the charges that they bring, but they don't think they can win the felony charges, but they can win the misdemeanor charges. And then the punishment for that charge has flexibility. It can be as little as you plea bargain. It can be as much as you fight for. If the charge was you need to plead guilty to misdemeanor charges, but no jail time whatsoever. We're only talking about probation here. We're only talking about paying a fine, whatever it is. He's going to settle the civil suits on his own, but as far as the criminal charges go, no jail time whatsoever. Would a plea bargain be possible if he had to admit guilt, not a no contest plea, which John leaned heavily on yesterday? He might take no contest, but he's not going to say I'm guilty of anything. I said if he's looking at like 10 years in jail and they're going to offer him just probation, if you're the attorney for that person, you have to at least bring it to him and say this has to be a consideration. Is there something like that potentially in play that if they get an indictment, there could be a plea bargain and there could be even an admittance of guilt?
So if you take a plea bargain, what it is by definition is admission of guilt. So that's number one. And then Jody and John, we're kind of working on a sliding scale here because right now we're only dealing in a vacuum with the criminal case. What's on the other side of this? No matter what happens in the criminal case, no matter what happens in the civil case, Roger Goodell is waiting there on the other side of the sideline, and he's waving his hand like, "Hey, you got to deal with me after this." So, we looked at it for our show, I guess last night. But Roger Goodell had a comment. I think it was at the end of October. People were wondering why he was never placed on the commissioner's exempt list because Goodell said we don't have enough to place him on it. So the second he takes a plea to something, certainly Goodell has enough to punish him, right? So that's number one. The second, I think Watson gives a deposition in the civil case, which he was about to do. Now he's not. He's going to plead the fifth. I think he's got enough to punish him on the civil in the NFL world. So he's got a couple arrows pointed at him that will lead to a suspension. So Jody, John, you kind of asking me, right, what the move is here. As lawyers, all we can really do is look at precedent, right? And really, if we're strategizing, we have to look at what has happened recently to help guide us. Trevor Bauer over in the baseball world, similar, I don't want to say necessarily similar case, but also sexual assault charges. What his attorneys did, and they said, you know what, if we accept anything here, I don't know if Bauer's ever going to play again. These the allegations are pretty heinous. It was really kind of messy sexual assault, rape allegations. And what did Bauer's attorney do? They went into court, guns a-blazing. They weren't going to settle, and they won. And then the DA's office said, well, if you guys won on the civil case, we can't really win on the criminal case. It's a higher burden. So now Bauer, right, he's kind of cleared his name. You might like Bauer, you might hate him. He cleared his name. And if Watson wants to return to the NFL, right, and Jody, you pointed out, a plea deal could be 10 years in jail, right? It could be 5 years in jail. I don't know what they're necessarily going to charge him with, a felony and misdemeanor beyond that. But if there's a world where he can get no jail time, I think he jumps at that immediately because that's your path to return. As you guys know, Mike Vick, right, served his time. He came back to the Eagles. But we're in this world for this past year, and why I'm not sure we're going to get clarity tomorrow, Friday, is because we don't know when that end point is for Watson. We know that Vicks he took a plea, he served his time in jail, that was it. Watson still has the civil case dragging, right? So, I think, Jody, to your question, I think if there was a plea deal on the table for him to admit guilt and not to serve jail time, then he's really looking at Goodell. Goodell can make the decision. So I think he would lean towards doing it, but we haven't gotten the impression that it's on the table yet. So, we got to see what happens there.
And speaking of you mentioned your show. I want to talk about that. Conduct Detrimental is the podcast, so make sure you listen to that with Dan. When we talk about Deshaun Watson and Friday, if you go back a couple weeks, they had that hearing, Dan, where Rusty Hardin was very confident. It seemed that things were going to clear up from a criminal perspective by April 1st, I think was the date he gave. Why did he know that? How did he know that? Is that something, is the grand jury calendar? Is that public? Is that, how did he understand that it was going to move forward at least at some point, good or bad?
So I got to take a little bit of an issue with my fellow attorney, Rusty Hardin. Sometimes lawyers get a bad rap, right? You guys are faux attorneys over here, right?
Yeah.
You guys get a bad rap too. All the attorneys get bad raps.
Yeah.
But Rusty Hardin has been saying for a long time, he's been saying since day one of this case, we welcome the grand jury. We love this. We'd love to get clarity. If you put him under oath, right? He couldn't say that. He couldn't say that. If you injected him with truth serum, he couldn't say that. No attorney welcomes their client to be put in front of a grand jury because, again, more often than not, the grand jury indicts. It's like if you're the attorney and your hands are tied behind your back and your mouth is tied shut and you can't defend your client, why would you want your client to be subjected to that? So that's Rusty Hardin's PR spin. He doesn't want this, but he can't avoid it. How does he know, John, to your question? The DA, as my understanding is, told him. They said, hey, we're going to present this case to a grand jury. What's your side of the case? And I've been going on other shows the past couple of weeks, and I've been saying the fact that the DA is asking Rusty Hardin for his side of the version of the events is not a good thing. Because if the DA's office was planning to let this case go, they don't need Rusty Hardin's version of events. So the fact that they were asking him, hey, we need some more details here, we need some more cooperation, tells you at best, right? At best, it's a 50-50. So I think what they told Rusty Hardin is, hey, we're going to be presenting the case to a grand jury in the month of March. And the grand jury doesn't normally take 3 weeks, if anything, maybe a week or so. So yeah, that's how he knew that. My understanding is that the DA's office reached out and gave him a heads up that it was going to happen. Here's your last chance to give us some more facts to maybe help your cause.
do want to ask you about precedent, because you just said that is a big part of the entire legal proceeding and legal world. I was a little surprised this week when the former Falcons, I shouldn't say former, but suspended Falcons wide receiver was found guilty of wagering on games. He had been shut down because of mental health issues at the end of last year. And the NFL acted quickly and what seemed to me to be harshly by suspending him for an entire year. Then when I found out that when there had been previous suspensions in the NFL for gambling, they'd always been a year. Everybody had always been a year. So he only got what everybody else got. Is it looked at, or should it be looked at different now that the NFL has joined in partnership with gambling? Forever they were so much against it. They wouldn't let Jimmy the Greek make picks on the air. We can't have any tie between gambling and the NFL. Oh, there's ties aplenty and $1 billion aplenty being exchanged between the two. But the precedent was, if you do it, it's a year. Did the NFL handle it right this week?
So I might give an unpopular opinion. Jody and John, I'm looking at your background. I see Ocean Casino and Resort. I've been there. I am a gambler. I'm very conscious that if I was an NFL player, right, I could not do certain things. There's certain allowances you can and can't have. The world of casinos and gambling is obviously very different than it is in 2022. Same with DraftKings, FanDuel. You go down the list. I'm going to take the unpopular opinion here. It's 2022. Calvin Ridley knows better than to place a bet in his own name, right?
Right.
We're decades into the Pete Rose saga, right? Paul Hornig, like that happened like decades ago. Everyone knows those rules. There is a zero tolerance policy. Maybe your listeners maybe don't know this, and I learned this past week. The NFL players are actually allowed to wager on fantasy sports up to $250. They're allowed to do that under the NFL guidelines. But there is zero tolerance, none, nada, zilch for betting on sports. So, personally, I think that Ridley got pretty lucky here because he bet on his own team. So I know he wasn't with the team at the time. I know he was away with different mental health issues, but he bet on his own team. I don't know how the NFL could say there wasn't inside info involved. I think Ridley is lucky to only get a year. Honestly, you cannot, I don't care how much money is bet. In this day and age in 2022, to bet in your own name with your own address, it's just the worst type of crime that occurred, right? So, maybe in the 70s, Pete Rose is betting with a bookie right behind the scenes. Nobody knows what's going on. But he bet out in the open with an app and he registered his name. I mean, that's pretty careless. So I think he's lucky.
Should get a year of punishment and a year for stupidity. For doing so in his own name.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, the year I get, I'm not going to really, I don't think it should be 2 years or more, but I think he is lucky. But that was the most surprising part to me. It's not surprising that NFL players are finding ways to place bets, maybe through proxies or otherwise. But I am surprised that someone like Calvin Ridley, who clearly knows the rule, would be that careless with placing a wager like that.
Dan, I'm going to tap into 2-year backgrounds. For those who don't know, Dan used to be in public relations with the New York Giants.
Don't hold it against me.
In a prior life, prior part of life. Do you ever look around this league? The Dallas Cowboys, that Jerry Jones pays, I think it was $2.4 million out in a voyeurism scandal that emanated from his chief PR exec. And now we have a paternity suit. Now, not to mention the Washington football team and all the issues they've had and the way the NFL has said, and I think I've talked to you about this in the past, there's not a lawyer in the world that says, hey, no written, don't do a report with no written work. I don't want to see written work. Does it ever frustrate you how the NFL and its owners handle their business at times?
Yes, and I had a feeling you guys would ask me about the Jerry Jones case. I don't know what's going on in Dallas over here. I mean, those guys, first they have the cheerleader settlement, which we'll talk about, obviously, and then this paternity test is wild. So, and of all places, ESPN is reporting it. So, I think that's probably part of the narrative, right? The NFL conducts business in a way for years that I don't know if you want to call it the player empowerment era or the Me Too era, the woke era, whatever you want to call it. It's now this kind of perfect storm where the NFL is feeling the brunt of it. It started happening in Washington. In my office, my law office has fielded some calls about potential lawsuits around the league. So like there's something something going on in the waters of the NFL. And maybe it's just that. Maybe it's as simple as saying, John, like, people aren't afraid to go after the NFL anymore. They're not afraid to go after the Shield. Not to get too far in the weeds, but with these type of sexual assault, sexual harassment type cases, people are only empowered to go for it if they can come up in numbers, right? So that's what we saw happen in Washington. We had some of the former employees on my podcast to explain their stories, explain how much they hate Dan Snyder, which I'm sure Philly fans can unite with.
I think Washington fans could unite.
I think all NFL fans can unite around their hatred of Dan Snyder. But these women in Washington, these courageous women in Washington, have been kind of now this benchmark for other employees around the league to step up. And even now, right, these former cheerleaders, right, clearly they're speaking to the media. Somehow this got out. Somehow this leaked with this Cowboys voyeurism charge. But there's certainly something in the waters. And I think it's just, hey, these women in Washington stood up, and now they're getting backed by Congress. They're getting so much support across the NFL. Maybe we should do this. And it's not immune to football. Phoenix Suns had a similar scenario.
Yeah.
It's really happening around sports right now. So we're certainly seeing a change in the waters.
I want to ask you about the Brian Flores case before we run out of time here today. The Miami Dolphins filed to have the case handled by Roger Goodell in an arbitration process, which I guess they have the right to do as per the contract that Flores signed and was under when he was the Dolphin head coach. Brian Flores certainly wants to take the Dolphins and the Giants and the entire National Football League to court. Will that be preempted? Does his own contract with the Dolphins give them the ability to sidetrack a potential lawsuit in a court of law? This came as a surprise to me. I probably should have known about it ahead of time, but I didn't. That the Dolphins just said, no, wait. We got a process here. We can go to arbitration first in front of the commissioner. What do you mean going into a court of law? We want no part of that. Give us a background there. Shame on me. I should have known of it. I came as a surprise when I read it. Please educate me and our listeners.
Well, Jody, this is why you and I have to talk more. I could have told you that. That's the NFL's move here. So they're doing it actually similarly, which I'm sure we can't talk about. But the John Gruden stuff made the same move over in his case to move that case to arbitration. Is essentially under an employment contract, right? That's what the fight is over, whether they fired Gruden improperly. Okay, so it's got to be under the employment contract, which says it goes to arbitration. Flores is a little bit different. He's going to have a better argument than Gruden's going to have, because Flores is not necessarily alleging a claim of wrongful termination. He's alleging a class action lawsuit that involves all these former candidates for head coaching jobs and general manager candidates, and he's alleging racial discrimination. That's much less obvious, relating to Brian Flores' singular contract with the Miami Dolphins. So that's really going to be his argument here. This is a class action lawsuit about racial discrimination. It's not solely about wrongful termination. It's not. So that's his argument. Not to say it's a winning argument, but if I'm picking my horse here, I'd much rather be on Flores' side on that arbitration case than Gruden's. I think that case is going to get kicked to arbitration, and then then you have Mr. Goodell as the judge, jury, and execution over here. You can't like the chances in that form.
Follow him at Sports Law of Lust. You see it there, Dan Lust, best in the business as far as I'm concerned from a sports legal standpoint. So, Phil, for Brian Flores, last one from me, Dan. You mentioned the class action part. How do you get the numbers to be successful in that when so many of the guys who would maybe want to be involved are employed in the league just like he is now? It's as a lawyer, would that be the way you would have went to go class action?
Well, I think they probably did it because of the arbitration reason. I think that was at least the conversations we're having amongst lawyers. That was one of them. But there are a slew of former coaches, right, that haven't been out of the league for so long. That have actually spoke out. Marvin Lewis spoke up in this case. Hugh Jackson has spoke out about the case. So. And there are a number of former or current coaches that are named in the complaint. Eric Bieniemy over in Kansas City. So, I would be fearful if I was a coach thinking whether or not I'm going to join this case. Brian Flores went from hottest head coaching candidate in the middle of the interview circuit, which if I'm his lawyer, you asked me, John, what I would have done and would not have done. I wouldn't have filed a lawsuit while he was interviewing for the Texans and Saints head coaching jobs. I think that probably ruined his chances. you could tell me, which a lot of people have, hey, well, now he has a retaliation claim. He can add that to his lawsuit against the Texans and Saints that they didn't hire him because he filed the lawsuit. And I'm like, great. But wasn't the guy's dream to continue to be a head coach in the NFL? So, I get that maybe he's added more dollars to his case value. But, the messaging from Flores' side was, I want to be a head coach in this league. And now he's settled to be a linebackers coach. And no one's going to convince me that he would have been a linebackers coach but for the filing of this lawsuit. So I think that was a tactical error. And I'm not here to blame Brian Flores. I'm here to blame his attorneys for maybe wanting a bigger share of the spotlight during that 2-week lead up to the Super Bowl. Coincidentally, that's when the lawsuit was filed. So congrats. They drummed up a lot of attention to this lawsuit, but I think they really, materially harmed Brian Flores' coaching trajectory. If you wanted to, right? And if everyone's listening clearly, have your cake and eat it too. Get the job with the Houston Texans. Get it with the New Orleans Saints. He was a finalist for those jobs. And then if you're really that angry at the Giants, right? You're that angry at the Dolphins or the Broncos, the other team mentioned this lawsuit, file after you get those jobs, right? And then you put the NFL in a very uncomfortable position. But I don't really love that he ended up as a Steelers linebackers coach. I think that sends the wrong message.
We know Dan Lutz will be paying close attention to what goes on in the Houston courtroom on Friday, as will we. He gave us some good information to be able to judge for ourselves what happened.
Before you get me out of here, my father-in-law, your good friend Alan, he says he's remembering fondly your celebration in the early morning hours of the 1986 World Series against the Red Sox. He told me to remind you of that.
Yes.
He said
the crew that Biggs and I were part of were much more Met fans than Yankee fans. We had one T-Turd was a Yankee straggler, but the rest of us were all Met guys. So yes, the celebration was good when the Mets won the World Series in 1988. Tell Biggs I send my regards, Dan Lust. John, and I wish you our regards as well. Thanks for coming on. We're going to tap into you again down the road.
My pleasure, guys. Anytime.
Thanks,
Dan Lust here with us on Birds 365. Yes, his father-in-law was a good buddy of mine. From
I know, Jody.
It's the Jody Mac Buddy Show today.
I know.
Randy Brown, the mayor of Martin. Dan Lust,
and by the way, I'm the one who book both guests, and I'm like, well, yeah, Jody, I just use your name. You're a legend, man. Look, people are talking about your celebrations at 86. Randy Brown's talking about Cherokee High School. I'm like, yeah, Jody Mack's on the show. I say John McMullen. They go, oh, yeah, maybe. I say Jody Mack, and then everybody lights up.
Prior to COVID, I used to get around. Yeah, Johnny Mac. I had a social life. There were people who actually knew me before I got out of my basement hanging out.
Everybody knows you. That's why I used the Jody. I'm admitting I used the Jody Mac name. I say Jody Mac. Okay. I say I don't use my name. I'm not getting anywhere.
We'll use anything to get good guests here on Birds 365. That's because we care about you guys. Here's how much we care about you guys. We're going to come back and put a bow on the show. Stick around.